How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. Annie Dillard, The Writing Life. The Daily Grind, Chapter 192. The Red Lion Hotel was slightly less of a mess inside than it appeared from the parking lot. From the front it looked like a series of three-story buildings, divided up into hotel rooms, with maybe a few of the ground floor sections set aside for renting out to business conferences or wedding parties. It also looked like it had been in an active war zone for the last year, and not just a small town in Tennessee. Holes in the walls, shattered windows, cars in the parking lot with smashed windshields and dented doors when they weren't just torn in half or flipped over. The vegetation around it was dead or dying. The brass and color of the double doors that led into the front lobby was warped and torn out of its frame. In a lot of places, sheets of plywood covered up some of the worst gaps. The parking garage was even worse. It looked like a demented porcupine, 100 spines of concrete and asphalt trailing off it in shapes that looked curved and organic, but were no less solid for all that appearance. The inside was worse too. Those same spikes piercing vehicle after vehicle, occasionally going into tight corners or straight into walls. Many of them ended at points where the ground was stained with red and black blood splotches. The Order members that were camping out here had done a good job peeling the asphalt spears out of the hotel itself, but that just made it stand out more in a city where no building had escaped undamaged. Inside, in contrast, well, it was a different kind of mess, at least. Saying it was less of a mess might have been a lie, but the direction of mess was different. Outside, the mess had already happened. It was a constant effort to bring everything back to a usable state, as weather and time continued on. Inside, it had been a more or less empty building, and it was a constant effort by the Order members working there to fill it with a city's worth of stuff. Even through the damage that had clearly showed on some of the walls and bits of ceiling, it was still a pretty alright place to be. James wandered past the abandoned front desk to the dining hall, where the team here kept a big fireplace roaring, giving the whole building a warm and inviting feeling, even as the temperature outside continued to drop while winter wore on. The building was cluttered, yes. Piles of gear and recovered items lined the walls around here, sometimes piling up in the middle of the floor. The majority of the furniture that was still intact had been shifted into a giant stack over in the far corner when it wasn't in use. But it wasn't dirty. A handful of green orbs stacked onto the building rapidly eliminated trash, too, which sometimes seemed to include dirt in the carpet. Sometimes. There were also a couple of people here, holding down the fort and enjoying the warmest room in the building since there was minimal electricity. James nodded to Yin as he passed by, the rogue draped half upside down over the side of a couch, not even seeming to notice him, and moved over to greet the person he was actually here to see. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" James asked, standing what one of his etiquette skills told him was exactly the right distance away to be seen as polite but not awkward. James loved that skill orb. He didn't know which one it was exactly, but he loved it all the same. It removed a lot of ambiguity, and despite a helpful ongoing dose of antidepressants, James still did have that low-level panic every time he needed to determine exactly how far away someone had to be before it was impolite to hold a door open for them. "I'm not busy," Kirk replied to him, trying to cover up his worry by sounding casual, closing the book he was reading. No, not a book, a manual, something highly technical, too. James didn't even try to read the name. Kirk was one of a handful of the Route Horizon cultists who had both survived the Mechanic's attempted apotheosis and also chosen not to accept a memory wipe from Planner. He, along with 3 others, instead chose to accept the Order's form of restorative justice. Working mostly to secure and salvage the ruined city of Taunton, the sandy-haired and scarred man and his fellow ex-cultists did what they could to balance the scales on the atrocity that they had been part of. Though in truth, that wasn't really the point at all. If the scales of justice were real, James was sharply aware that there would never be a where to tip them back. Thousands of people had been killed from the actions of only a dozen. That wasn't something that you even could work off, not really. Instead, the point was, well, about the same as how the Order treated their student aspirants. The point was to change the nature of a person, to bring them to a way of living through conversation, education, compassion, and practical example, where they would never do again what they had done before. Where they were still themselves, but also someone else entirely. Someone unrecognizable, maybe. You couldn't undo the past, and it was all too easy to fall into the trap of thinking that punishing people for their transgressions was acceptable, because it felt good. It felt good to hurt the people who had hurt you. But it didn't really build a future that anybody wanted to live in. James hadn't actually talked to Kirk since offering him a job, place. English kind of broke down when you started making common use of new methodology for social structures. They'd have to come up with something for this. Or find a blue orb that added new words. That sounded like proper officium mundi bullshit. Regardless, no matter how much time had passed, Kirk still recognized James when he approached. And it was clear from how tense he was under the bland look on his face. "You're not in trouble, relax," James said, looking around for a place to sit and eventually giving up and planting himself on the edge of the remarkably sturdy coffee table between the couch and the fireplace. "How are things going?" "That could mean so many different things," Kirk said with a sigh. "Do you mean in the city?" "Sure," James shrugged and offered a smile. Kirk set the technical manual he'd been reading on the couch arm next to himself. "It's still a mess," he stated. "Everything is kinda bad. Lots of rotting food. It smells awful. A bunch of places where fires took out residential blocks, buildings falling apart when the road spikes give out, that sort of thing." Kirk looked away for a second. "Lots of bloodstains everywhere, too." "You doing okay?" James asked softly. "Nah," the middle-aged man snorted. "Course not, but who would be, right? Just a reminder every time we go out how bad it was. Seems fair, you know?" "In retrospect," James said as he realized something, "it might be considered cruel and unusual punishment to station you here. Do you want to go somewhere else?" "No," Kirk answered, a little too fast. No, this is where..." James gave a small, sad smile to him. "This is where the horizon is, right?" "Yeah." The word carried with it a lot of guilt. "Man, you don't have to justify yourself to me." James almost laughed. How's the road anyway?" "Still sleeping," Kirk reported, excitement creeping into his voice as he talked about Route Horizon. "We've only been in 4 times. The Necrodes like to hang around the entrance, so you have to be careful when we do it, but the inside is calmer. Without the old man, without..." His voice broke and he clenched a fist, but he still met James's eyes. "Without going in to sacrifice people, there's just more time to explore. We've been collecting map scraps and gears and a bunch of other stuff. There's more out there than I ever even imagined." "Glad to hear you're enjoying it," James said earnestly. "What was that about the Necrodes? They're still around?" "Oh, yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, there's thousands of them. We used to get into fights with the things when they showed up while we were out searching the city, but they kinda stopped. Some of them still watch us. There's packs of them that go by on the Horizon's portal. Sometimes they might attack or posture a little bit, but I think that a lot of them are hiding." "Well, that's something." James rubbed at his chin. "Okay, I got a personal question for you." "Shoot." "Do you get along with everyone here?" James asked him. Kirk gave an almost sheepish look. "No," he said, and then continued with a sigh. "No, I don't. You probably don't want to know the specifics, but no." It was an honest answer, and James appreciated that, which was what he was looking for, really. "Anything that could be a big problem?" he asked Kirk. "Oh, no." Kirk shook his head vehemently. "Even if somebody annoys the fuck out of me, I'm not going to screw them over on the run or something. We all know that." He straightened his back, eyeing James like he was daring the younger man to challenge the small community that they had here. But that wasn't really what James was asking either. "Okay," he said. "So how are you doing? Honestly, how do you think you're doing overall?" Kirk blinked slowly. I'm better," he admitted. "It's like When I was in high school, my friend and I stole a bottle of really, really bad vodka from a liquor store, and then drank it in fucking hour. And a decade later, I can remember that, and I know it was me, but all I can think now is, wow, high school me was a fucking moron. And now I'm doing that again, but like older. I was a fucking moron. In so many ways, and I probably still am, but God, I'm trying, man. I feel that in a painfully real way, James said to him. So, one last question, with a little bit of preface. He took a long breath. The Order of Endless Rooms now has custody of 3 individuals responsible for a number of unethical things. That was a mild understatement. They have agreed, mostly, to something similar to what you did. Kirk nodded. Good. Glad that worked out, he said. When James raised his eyebrows at him, Kirk just shrugged. We're not out of the loop down here. We get Order news. Also, half of us were there when you decided the strategic approach to these twats. Okay, well, that gets to my question. James pressed his fingers together and arrowed them toward Kirk. Would you be interested in being the guide for one of these people? Like an AA sponsor? Kirk asked slowly. I'm not actually sure how Alcoholics Anonymous works, but probably closer to that than a probation officer, which is what someone else compared it to, James said. So, a little yes, let's say. Kirk tilted his head back, not thinking much before he asked in a firm voice, Why me? Because you've been there, James said. Because you know. And also, more personally, because I think you'd resonate with the feeling of wanting to explore something weird that this particular person seems to have. Do I get a raise? Kirk asked. James acknowledged that the man was joking, but he had an answer prepared anyway. Yes, he said happily. We're going to be moving to a kind of moving pay scale thing, determined by a base income that's modified by what responsibilities a person takes on. It's one of the perks of a replicator-based wealth generation system. What, like universal basic income? Well, it's hardly universal, it's just for anyone who's part of the Order. But yes, universal within our tiny sphere of influence. James shook his head. Also, we're getting sidetracked. Yeah, that happens around here, Kirk said knowingly. Look, you don't need to answer now, James told him, pushing off the coffee table and standing up, swiping his coat back into a less ruffled position. And we'll be setting up a protocol for guides to meet with each other regularly, work to improve the whole process. I am positive that this is going to come up again, so you've got a week or two to actually... Yes, Kirk said, holding out a hand to stop James. Yes? Yes. James glanced around and then shrugged. Okay, that was easy, he said. Good. Good, thanks. James shook his hand and added Kirk to the relevant parts of the Order's discussion server, said goodbye, and made to leave. Yeah, Kirk said quietly behind him as he left. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me to this, Momo told James as she joined him in the dedicated experimentation basement. Though, you know there's, like, a party going on upstairs, right? Yeah, it's Christmas, James answered. Or Christmas adjacent? I don't know, I lost track of the day, and I'll go back up in a bit. I'm kind of just taking a break from the noise right now. He looked around the experiment basement. Merry Christmas? Want to do some magic? It wasn't really the dedicated experimentation basement. They had a pretty hard time dedicating their basements to any one singular task. The research basement was also where they kept their spatially folded medical wing, a garden, and their vault. The response basement was home to a recording studio, a garden, and their private servers. And there were 2 different basements set aside for full or part-time residents of the lair, but people still lived in the research basement or the response basement sometimes, and also the 2 set-aside floors were, well, they were mostly exactly what they were, but one of them did have a cavernous public bathhouse in it. Compared to that, the basement they hadn't really done much with yet was practically their dedicated experimentation basement. It also had a mech in it, A 20-foot-tall asphalt construct supported by a collage of different dungeon tech items, meant to be piloted by somebody in an LSD-induced dissociative episode while a co-pilot kept them on track via brain link. It wasn't combat ready, and ideally it never would be. It was meant to be a telepad-enabled forklift. The basement also had, at this moment, in amongst the various computer engineering projects and the small-scale mock-up of a space elevator, 2 long tables where James had piled a bunch of his own experimental nonsense, and now, in addition to James, it had Momo. "I get that," Momo said to him. "It was kind of loud upstairs, though we should be on the lookout for people sneaking down here to make out." "I put up a sign," James told her. Momo chuckled. "I saw. Well, whatever, thanks, anyway, for asking me." "Yeah, of course," James told her easily, looking up as she came in and tried to find a chair. "This is really more your department than mine, anyway." "Do you have a department?" Momo asked, rapidly giving up on her search for a chair and just dropping heavily to the floor, swishing her bathrobe out around her legs as she sat cross-legged. "I know you don't hang out around research much." "My brain is not good at that kind of thinking," James admitted. "I mean, I could be, I guess. Like, I know it's a skill, and I know it's not an innate thing, but I always get a headache trying to keep a bunch of moving variables in mind while trying to figure out what a random pencil does, you know?" "I don't," Momo cheerfully replied. James snorted at her. "Sure, okay. You comfortable there? You can have my chair. I'm probably going to pace around a lot anyway." "Nah, I'm good. I have magic bones or something." "Really?" "Nah." James gave Momo a disappointed sigh and a shake of his head. "Alright, whatever. So, got any insights for me on this, as our resident witch? Or should we just dive into making mistakes?" The "this" that James was talking about was part of his current attempt to try to not be the least magically inclined person in the entire magical organization that was the Order of Endless Rooms. For the first time in a while, there was no crisis looming. No dungeons out of control, no shadowy groups trying to kill them. The government couldn't find them. And it was nice. Quiet. And among all of that, James had realized that despite being the one who had probably eaten the most skill orbs out of anyone here, he probably had the least firm grip on how to make the best use of half the stuff the Order had access to. Momo, operating just on instinct and practice, could apparently make totems out of the red orbs that could do stuff way outside of half the literal spells that James had access to. Dave could absorb twice as many blue orbs as James could. And there were a half-dozen people who had all found ways to make life of varying types beyond the one that James had the skill to awkwardly manifest. He felt like he was falling behind. There was no other way to really frame it. He didn't have some desire to be the literal best at everything, and James was keenly aware that he wasn't some predestined chosen one. But he actually felt like he'd spent so long running from crisis to crisis that he hadn't gotten a lot of time that the other people had to sit down and screw around with this stuff. Work with it, play with it, until he hit upon something cool, and learned how to work with it and play with it better. So he had acquired a pile of blue and yellow orbs and an equal pile of random stuff that was expendable that had been lying around in the basement storage, and decided to take some time exploring his own understanding of magic item creation. "I mean, I'm a big fan of making constant mistakes," Momo said, flopping back onto the smooth concrete floor, arms over her head. "Also, I don't know what insights I'd have for you, you know? I'm new to this too." "You literally make magic items all the time." James shook his head at her with a baffled look on his face. Momo made a sputtering, dismissive noise. "Those don't count. Red totems are just lines that look good, and then I fuck around with the materials until they work right, and then I make them small." She radically oversimplified her process to a near useless degree. "This is different. This is... I don't know, this is weird." "Well, I'm with you there," James agreed, fiddling with one of the perfectly normal pencils he had picked up for this. "Also, aren't you cold down here? I'm wearing a sweatshirt and this place is chilly." "Purple," Momo said simply. "I divorced myself from the human feeling of being uncomfortable." "Some people might say that's unhealthy." "Not you, though, Mr. I Want to Be Immortal." Get your ass off the floor and help me figure out what to do with a pencil, James laughed. Here was where things got kind of tricky. In theory, both of them knew how this worked. You built an idea of what a thing could do, and then you told the blue orb to make that happen, using a yellow as kind of a power source attached to it. From reading the notes that other people had made, it seemed like it worked better the closer the outcome was to what the object was supposed to do, if you didn't want it to fail. There weren't enough completed tests so far to get a good idea of exactly how things ended up when they failed, but that was part of what James and Momo were doing here today. Momo grunted as she pulled herself off the floor, wiping a hand through her determinedly regrowing hair and stealing James's chair as he stood up to start pacing around the table as promised. Okay, well, writing, obviously. Why not just make one that translates? I'm worried that won't work if I don't know other languages, honestly, James said. What about just a font? What, like writing in Times New Roman? Momo asked. Sure, go for it. Okay, here. He handed her a pencil and a pair of orbs for herself. Momo looked at the objects she'd taken without thinking about it. What? Yeah, you too, James said. We're testing here. Also, I've got a ton of these things. So, Times New Roman, let's go. We make it work or we don't, and then we compare notes. Hopefully in Times New Roman. He grinned at Momo, who glanced up at him and gave an eager smile and nod back. Then, the much harder part, he looked at the objects in his hands, and after realizing he didn't have a good way to balance three things with two hands, James set the pencil on the table and held the orbs against it, and started trying to think. To picture what it should do, building a model for a power. What did a pencil do? How did he want it to change? James took a deep breath as he started to come up with more and more questions for himself, and realized this was going to be a lot more thorough than just wishing for something to be magic. He let his mind wander down different paths. What did a pencil do? Well, it wrote. It made marks. What did he want it to do? Well, make marks, but in different patterns. With the new secondary pattern of a font, Times New Roman specifically, with its little serif flourishes and thick, thin letters. Standardize the marks, take what was written, and make it this. He pressed a little too hard, and a yellow orb popped in his fingers. +1 skill rank, agriculture, soybeans, soil conditions. James opened his eyes and frowned. He might need a different approach, and a new orb. Fetching one, he closed his eyes again and took another deep breath. The pencil wrote. He wanted it to do that, but with this extra thing on top. But what if someone wrote badly? Well, fix it. What if somebody wrote a typo? Ignore it, you can make typos in any font. What if... He let himself go down a trail of different questions, putting together a list of contingencies, different answers to dumb suggestions, and suddenly something clicked in his head. Because James had run D&D games for his friends before, and this was a very familiar process. He grinned idly as he added his growing list of answers to stupid questions into his mental model of what a font was, and his conception of how a pencil worked. Sometimes he would correct or update a way that he had phrased how the object worked, but he kept that core idea in mind. A pencil wrote. It marked. Everything flowed from that. All he needed was for this object to understand that it had a task to do. His hands tingled with the soft dusting of an ethereal salt, and then a sudden lack of pressure. James opened his eyes and saw the last bits of dust from the orbs trailing away, but no notifications in his head to go with it. Just an innocent-looking, untouched number 2 pencil, sitting there, proudly. You done yet? Momo asked with a casual air. James glanced over at her to see her with her feet up on the table, near the set of objects he'd stacked up for later, a pencil twirling in her grip. Ha! See, I knew you'd have an insight into this, James said. Part of him felt like he'd felt before. Behind. Not good enough. But that wasn't how this worked, was it? They were a team here, and Momo being good at this just meant fewer points of failure for when something monstrous inevitably ate him. Also, part of him was proud for making a magic item at all. You want to test these? He asked her. Did you bring a pencil sharpened? Okay, you did. Momo cut herself off as James slid an electric pencil sharpener across the table as much as it would easily move on the bumpy surface. You first, she said, so I can look good later. Next time I'm inviting the high schoolers, not you, James threatened her with a snarky grin as he ran his pencil into the sharpener with a whirring buzz. Pulling it out when it was good enough to work and pulling over a sheet of scrap paper, he quickly started writing random words on it, and rapidly found himself laughing at the output. Okay, so... He held up his work. A few words, written in a certain font, all of them much larger than he had meant, but undeniably what he was going for. The teacher's going to dock you points if you don't turn in the essay at size 12, Momo told him. Oh God, don't give me flashbacks, James shuddered. Alright, let's try yours, he said. Momo went through the same process, sharpening, scribbling, and then looking, but when she looked up to James, her expression was a curious one. She shifted the paper over to him. Normal-looking handwriting, though Momo's was obviously different from his, and not just because of the font magic. That's weird. I know it's magic. What did it... She trailed off, looking at the pencil in her hand. And then James started laughing, because he'd just looked at the pencil sharpener and turned it over so the warning label on the back faced Momo, as he tried to get his giggles under control. The whole thing, the label, and the name of the pencil sharpener itself now, branded on the plastic, was written in a rather specific font, and it certainly hadn't been before. Okay, so in fairness, mine did get the size right, Momo defended herself. Yes, very good, James gasped out, his laughter renewing itself as Momo also cracked and joined him. Eventually, the two of them got it out of their system and refocused. Okay, James said, wiping at his eyes. Okay, so that's a good start. Now let's do it again to see if we can get better before we try really weird stuff. They repeated the process 4 more times, each time trying different mental nudges to how they were approaching it, just to see what would happen. For James, it was kind of like trying to find the correct pattern. He was looking for the right way to do this, so that he could hit that mark on demand. For Momo, it was a little more like making art with new materials. She was looking for a style that fit her best. Both of them made a few mistakes. Mostly mistakes, really. Out of 8 more tries, James only got 2 more pencils working like he wanted, while Momo technically got 4. Some of the failures, the ones that weren't just accidentally popping an orb, were fun though. The pencil that would only make lines that were within the outline of the proper font was almost spitefully without use. The one that started fires if touched against anything that was Times New Roman also seemed that way. Until Momo pointed out that James seemed like he was getting irritated with the mental exercise, and they started to put together that it wasn't really possible for a person to completely isolate their thoughts and turn them into objects to use. Emotion always bled in, it seemed, as did idle thoughts and distractions. You know what this is mostly making me wonder? James asked, as he swept ashes off the lightly scorched table and into a garbage bag. How we have all these blue orbs? Momo asked. Like, dude, do you have any idea how hard it is for me to get people to bring me reds? I basically have to source my own. James refused to be sidetracked, but he had time for a small answer here. We find hundreds of magic pencils that are about this useful, and they get turned into size 1 blues at a constant rate, he told Momo. But no, I'm wondering... Well, actually, kind of that. Why do we find so many weird fucking pencils? Why are there so many dungeon tech items just lying around? This is fun and all, but we did just make a bunch of things that are basically useless except as benign-looking smuggling methods to get blue orbs through airport security without anyone asking why they can see color on the X-ray scanner. How bored is the dungeon that it is churning these things out? Oh, it's gotta be something other than boredom. Momo spun the chair she was in around, going just fast enough in the swiveling seat that she knew she'd be kinda sick when she stopped, but not stopping anyway. Maybe it's trying to talk to us. Momo, half the pens explode in some way. Maybe it's trying to talk to us, but it's also mad. Can't really argue with that. James snorted out a laugh. Okay, actually this time, let's see if we can make a pencil that explodes. Momo dropped her feet, stopped her spinning, causing herself to lurch as the dizziness caught up. That seems like a terrible idea. Okay, yeah, but I want to try something that isn't just pencil behavior, James said. How about generating electricity or something? Momo dragged her chair over to the table in short bursts against the concrete. How about, she suggested in a critical tone, something that can't kill us if we overdo it? Like, don't get me wrong, I know my rep around here is the brain damage and stuff, but come on, how about a pencil that flies? I can still see that killing us, but in a much more avoidable way, or a funnier way, so sure, James agreed. Once again, the two of them went silent as they focused on making something that did what they wanted. For James, it was almost easier to imagine what flight meant, even accounting for the GM mindset he was putting himself in, trying to answer expected stupid questions from players about how it worked in orbit, about what counted as flying versus hovering, and when he thought he had a good idea of what a flying pencil would do, he gave it a little mental push, and +1 skill rank, manufacture, boxes, cardboard. Momo's own swearing got him to look up, and he saw her holding one less orb, having gotten similar results. Okay, weird, James said. Why did that not work, but the other ones did? I thought I was getting kinda good at it. Is my mental prowess only strong enough for font? What were you thinking of? Momo asked. When yours broke? Answering dumb questions, James told her. Why, what about you? I'm mostly just sort of giving it a feeling, I guess, Momo said. Like, I know what flying is, so I'm trying to share that vibe. James hummed softly. And neither worked, he said. You know, we've actually found a pencil before that... I mean, it didn't fly, but it did ignore gravity. He paused. I think Pendragon ate it, actually. I can't prove that, but it would explain a lot. Pen is absolutely impacted by gravity. Momo rolled her eyes at him. Oh, right, we broke that one for an emergency. James smiled widely as he thought back on one of the more straightforward fights for his life that he had gone through. Good times. Momo looked like she was going to say something snarky, but then stopped. Hey, yo! She tapped the table rapidly, getting James's attention. What size orb? From that pencil? He tried to remember more than just the roughest outline of that day, which was now years ago. Also, he might have been hit in the head at the time. He wasn't sure. I think probably 2. It wasn't a size 1. It wasn't tiny. I remember that. Momo threw up her arms, staring at him with an expectant look on her face that gradually slipped as James just stared back, waiting for her input. Eventually, she dropped her arms and groaned. That's what Reed and the rest of the nerds are skirting around, Momo declared. The farther it is from being a pencil, the bigger a blue it requires. That's conjecture, James declared with a dramatic flair. I learned that word from hanging around those nerds, he added. No, you didn't. Also doesn't have to be. We have 2 of these. Momo threw him a slightly larger blue, and the 2 of them got back to work. James took a deep breath and focused on his visualization. Minutes ticked by again as they silently formed what they wanted in their heads. James kept his mind as focused as he could, a picture of what he wanted, and then pushed the power he was holding into the pencil. The number 2 pencil in front of him greedily ate the orbs from his hands, and then rocketed off the table so hard it nearly knocked the furniture onto its side. A tiny streak of yellowed wood and a pink eraser nub on the end, shooting up to the tall ceiling overhead and impacting like a bullet. James was staring upward, open-mouthed, when the orb from the now shattered item fell back down and landed in his throat, leaving him sputtering. +1 skill rank. Athletics. Catching. Problem solved. Spam email removed. That's not a problem that email doesn't already solve, he shouted, rubbing the back of his hand across his tongue that felt weird from either the sensation of the orb in his mouth or the spray of ceiling dust that had gone in with it. Okay, so I take back the thing about it not killing us, Momo said. James glared at her, about to say something, but then noticed the pencil leisurely orbiting her head, turning in a gentle pinwheel motion. Yours, obviously. Mine works fine. That actually looks really cool, James grudgingly admitted. And yeah, it did feel different, didn't it? Like there's a little more pull from the bigger blues. I didn't get that that was a feeling from the orb itself. Momo shook her head. Yeah, it honks, but humans don't seem to get magic without dungeon stuff. So anything like that is some kinda... that... honks? James asked. I got the word from Sarah, Momo cheerfully declared. It means it fucking sucks, but I can say it around kids and no one gets mad at me. She spun herself away from James again, spreading her arms to the rest of the stuff on the table. So, what's next? Because I see you brought down some Cameroconda arms. James perked up. I did, yeah, he said. Though it's one of the original models that aren't very good, I wanted to, see if we even could do something with this. Because it doesn't have any kind of socially ingrained conceptual weight like the abstract idea of a pencil does? Momo asked with a rapid burst of words. The sentence got a long blink and a tilt of James's head in reply. No, because I wasn't sure if we could even figure this out, but it turns out it's a lot easier than I expected. Sort of, once you have the general idea down. Conceptual weight? Yeah, like, my totems do some weird shit sometimes where they'll inform you on... not technicalities exactly, but like they can have trouble with new stuff, especially dungeon new stuff, like the Skelljacks. Momo idly lifted and spread out one of the mechanical arms from the Cameroconda-sized backpack, getting a gentle whir of the servos inside as she did. Like, they don't know things that aren't available knowledge or something. I've been sort of thinking of it as them tapping into a collective unconsciousness, because everything else is bullshit, so why not that too? Ah, and if that applies to blue items, then something like this wouldn't have anything to... I guess, hang an effect on, basically? James nodded slowly, following along. Okay, I get that. But also, the idea of prosthetic limbs is not new, so I feel like we can probably make it work, even if that is a condition. Momo grinned. Hey, I'm up for trying. What do you want it to do? James made a noise as he walked around to the other side of the table, sliding their pile of font experiments to the side. Work? Better? No. Be part of the user's body. Be more fluid. Grab properly. Maybe an improved lift strength. Oh, that's way too many things. Momo shook her head. James grunted in assent. Yeah. They had tried on one of their early tests to make a pencil that did two different things, and it just hadn't worked. Blue orbs could make literal magic, but only one twist of reality at a time, it seemed. Okay, let's keep this simple. Grabbing. Cool. Momo held up a tiny sliver of a blue orb. You or me? You were objectively better at this so far, though you did set the most things on fire, so... James trailed off, leaving Momo to flip him off with one hand and push the colored spheres in her other down on the assembly of arms. James had been closing his eyes, so he hadn't actually seen Momo's process. But now, watching, he noticed that she didn't seem nearly as meditative about the whole thing as he did. Momo scowled while she worked. Sort of. It wasn't an angry scowl, it was more the look of someone who was making faces while they worked, because what shape is my face in was just really far down their priority list, and it kind of got ignored. A minute ticked by, and then another. Momo shifted a few times, and James started pacing again, trying to do anything that wasn't interrupting her. A few times he caught her muttering small words. And then Momo clicked her tongue and shoved her hand all the way down to the mechanical device, letting out a yelp of either triumph or shock. It was kind of hard to tell with Momo. Was that a good barbarian yawp or a bad one? James asked. What? Momo glanced up, confused, and then her mouth solidified into a thin line. Oh, it's fine. I think I just screwed something up at the end. Well, let's see what you got. James rotated the mechanical backpack slightly and lifted one of the arms off the table. Doesn't feel any different like this, he commented, as Momo did the same on her side. Then he poked at the three-pronged gripping apparatus that capped off the arm, and froze. Or, more accurately, he just poked it, and then didn't pull away, because his finger would not come off of it. Uh-oh. James looked over to Momo, who was holding one of the grippers in her hand. James, help, She shook her arm furiously, like she was trying to get free, but it didn't change. Okay, well, we're all learning something today about literalism. James nodded calmly and ducked under the table, pulling the arm he was attached to, and also by association, Momo, over the surface as he grabbed his trusty problem-solving device. Coming back up, he hefted the crowbar that he had seized, and, without hesitation, hammered it down 4 times onto the backpack and the motor control assembly it held. On the 4th hit, something cracked enough that the magic considered the item broken. And, like the naturally sourced dungeon tech they had found, the entire object crumbled into dust, leaving behind only the orb on the table. The single hit point rule in effect. Good, good, James nodded. That still works. Hey, actually, do you think we could use this to get rid of highly toxic materials, or would that just leave toxic dust? Momo rubbed at her palm, opening and closing her hand now that it was freed. You can try that one out yourself, or buy me a hazmat suit. We have hazmat suits, James told her, as he swept the dust into the garbage bag to mix with the ashes of their earlier failure. There's, 2 of them in research. Momo, you live on this floor. How do you not know this? I sleep a lot, she defended herself. Whatever, I screwed that one up. Is there anything else you want to do? We've got 1 orb left. I mean, I want to say we should go find a status quo item and turn that into something weirder, James said. He wasn't even finished with his sentence before Momo was out of her chair and jogging down the hall, yelling over her shoulder that she'd be right back. No, Momo, I don't want to... We're going to blow something up. James stared at the darkened hallway that his science buddy had just run down inside. We're going to blow something up, Momo, he repeated to himself, quieter. But he followed it up with a resigned laugh anyway. By the end of the next day, Nate's team had stripped the alchemist's business mansion and all of their known stockpiles for everything of value. The fact that they even had a business mansion on top of their own individual personal use mansions made James a little sick at the sheer waste of it all, but by this point the knowledge that capitalism was an exponentially unfair system of exploitation wasn't exactly news to him, so he shrugged off the feeling. There were more solvable problems within reach right now. A lot of the personal wealth of the alchemists had been lost with the crippling of their organization and the deaths of many of their members. They had kept their operation an open secret of sorts, but they weren't protected by any infomorphs as far as the Order could determine, and so, when they had died, mundane systems of governance had taken over, and things like estate lawyers and tax law had kicked into effect, and James was fully prepared to get into a stand-up fight with a dragon, but he was less willing to get in the way of the IRS. Not now, anyway. But personal wealth aside, their true power wasn't money. Whether they acknowledged that or not. No, the thing that made them dangerous, and the thing the Order had more or less fully plundered, was 4 separate things. First, and strangely least, the orrery. The alchemists called it a room, but it wasn't really, it was just room-sized. An assembly of polished iron arms and wires and spheres. Moving it had been a nightmare, as had finding space for it in the lair, though eventually it had settled in the experimental basement near where James and Momo had been running their blue tests the day before. The problem was, no one knew how to use it. The orrery was so flagrantly magical, and every alchemist who was currently under their care knew what it did in abstract, but none of them knew how to make it work. In theory, it showed relative strength of different organizations. It could, if you knew the way to do it, target geographical locations, filter by policy, focus, or even size of the organizations you wanted to sort through. And through careful study, you could build a picture of who had influence where and what they wanted. No one had a fucking clue how to make it work. Some people were on it, though, but nobody was holding their breath. The second thing was the alchemist's stockpiles. Casks, sometimes barrels of potions that had been produced and stored for a rainy day, or ones that had simply not been taken to market yet. It was too much. And yet not enough. The logistics of big numbers reared its head again. They now had enough of the exercise potion to give everyone in the Order a year of heavy physical conditioning in about a week. Hell, they could do that for 1,000 people, maybe 2. But then they would be out of exercise potion. Stockpiles were not production, and without the ability to rapidly replace the potions, they were useful, but they were not reliable. Still, though, the one that could purge lung cancer that they now had 40,000 doses of was something that they were already planning to filter through their growing network of medical contacts. Third and fourth taken together were, well, the ability to replace those potions. A tree that grew fruits of golden liquid that could be processed into magical elixirs, and, to go along with that, the collective research of the Guild of Alchemists. What had survived, anyway. Decades of notes, test logs, and experiments, not to mention the combined understanding and instincts of their pseudo-prisoners. And it was disappointing. Their collective knowledge was disappointing. There was no other way to say it. James had found himself frowning as he'd skimmed through the entries while research had diligently added them to the Order's databases. There wasn't enough. Decades of notes, and this was all they'd come up with? 30 working potions, half of which were barely useful, the other half had taken years of iterating to get to their current potency, and that was it? The key to the why and how of it was his old nemesis capitalism. The alchemists had, at the end of the day, been a business. Their research and development was exactly what was needed to stay as a leader in their field, and when your field was the only provider of arcane elixirs, it wasn't hard to stay on top. Monopolies bred contempt and stagnation. Why work to make a better healing potion? After all, the healthcare industry already took the profits from that cash cow. Instead, just keep selling an exercise supplement to models and athletes and cash in on that. Why make a potion that could make someone permanently smarter? You've already got the one that politicians and lawyers will pay out the nose for just to read faster for a night. It was pretty telling that when alchemists Red and Nile were given a tiny amount of room and resources to experiment, they had developed a cure for lung cancer within 3 years. The alchemists could have done that decades ago, but it wasn't profitable, not compared to what they had already made with the fruit. The fruit of the tree of knowledge. Alternatively, the sap of the tree of knowledge, though it was still technically fruit as far as anyone could nail down the taxonomy of something that was obviously not mundane in origin. It was, on its own, nothing. Eating one wouldn't even taste like anything. But the liquid inside of it was an arcane catalyst that could turn anything into something wondrous. Or lethal. Or just bad. The alchemist's notes were full of one thing, and that was failures, which was itself quite useful. The tree itself had left James laughing his ass off for about 10 minutes when he had seen it. He had been imagining some kind of proud elm, golden light glittering through leafy green branches, towering over some central room in the alchemist's headquarters, or perhaps sequestered away in a basement, underground with a single skylight, shining the sun down onto a majestic, towering behemoth of a plant. And he had, to be fair, been close. It looked like an elm tree in appearance. It was also a bonsai and maybe 2 feet tall. I am starting to see, James commented to Nate, why they might have had a hard time producing large quantities of their potions. Don't touch the lamp, Nate told him, arms folded, not indicating which of the 3 grow lamps around the tree he actually meant. The tree likes the lamp. James hadn't been about to touch anything, and now he doubly wasn't. So Reed's already given me 15 requests for fruit to start experimenting with, he said quietly. Because, we've got some weird stuff in here. You want to be the one to try a potion made out of this and the shaper substance? Fuck off, Nate said bluntly. I'm going back to work. Enjoy your stupid tree. There's a meeting tomorrow, James called after him. To figure out what we're doing with the tree. I know, I'm catering it, Nate yelled back. James shook his head, staring at the green leaves dancing under the warm lights of the sun lamps. I don't think he knows what his actual job is, he said, to no one in particular, getting side glances from a few of the dozen Order members that were bustling around the area sorting their intake of materials, or just looking at the tiny magical tree. His phone beeped, and he looked down to see his alarm going off. He had to get ready for a sweeper run through the sewer. He nodded and pocketed his phone, turning to head toward the armory before he sighed. I don't think I know what my job is either, James muttered to himself as he left the room.